If you enjoyed the channel and our video content and would like to support us, you can do this in a couple of ways. You can sign up to our Patreon site, which is a monthly subscription to one of our 4 tiers, each giving you something different from early access interviews up to exclusive unseen footage. There's also the option of a one-off donation via PayPal, which allows you the option to donate an amount of your choice. Both options really help to keep this channel going and to continue putting out regular content for you good folk. So please take a look at aircrewinterview.tv/donate, and I thank you in advance. Thank you and enjoy. Andy, when did you become interested in aviation?
I'm one of those people who proves that there is something to be said for nature over nurture. I grew up in Coronado, California, about 5 blocks from the short final approach to runway 29 at Naval Air Station North Island, the original home of U.S. Naval Aviation. My late mom said that probably about the 5th word out of my mouth was pointing and going, airplane, airplane. So I grew up, growing up when I did the 50s, the 60s, over in the US, they didn't have that wonderful word, aviation enthusiasts, but now we're airplane geeks or airplane nerds. And I am cheerfully, happily willing to admit that that's exactly what I was. I was always interested in aviation. Drew airplanes as a little kid, built model kits. I belonged to a division of the Boy Scouts in the U.S. called the Explorer Scouts in a Air Explorer squadron. As an early teen, I got to have flights in the Beech C-45 and the Martin P-5 Marlin, which was very exciting. And then I joined the U.S. Air Force Auxiliary Cadet Program, the Civil Air Patrol, for a while. And then meandered off into other interests and on my way to reading history for my undergraduate degree.
Oh, why did you want to join the Navy and not the Air Force? And could you talk us through some of your basic ground and flying training once you joined the Navy?
Oh, sure. I was in undergraduate school during the late years of the Vietnam War. And I should say that growing up in a Navy town like Coronado, I was always kind of predisposed towards the Navy and naval aviation. I literally grew up with kids whose parents I later realized were some of the major naval aviation figures of World War II. Jimmy Thatch was Admiral Thatch, and he was just that grumpy old guy who didn't like us cutting our bikes across his lawn because his house was on a corner. Diz Laird, one of the great pilots in World War II, well, his daughter and I were classmates. All I knew is that her dad was in the Navy. So there was that kind of predisposition. I should mention my eyesight was judged as less than 20/20 going into my 5th year of elementary school. And I realized right then, oh, gee, I can't be a pilot in the Air Force or the Navy, but I knew there were such things as navigators and bombardiers. So I was like, well, I guess I'll do that then. When I was in graduate or undergraduate school, it was at a point where we didn't trust the then President Nixon to end the war, and we had a draft and a draft lottery in the United States. And a buddy of mine said, hey, there's some great guys here. They're looking for people to go into a program where you go to officer candidate school the summer between your 3rd and 4th year of undergraduate. You do about half of it. You go back to school. Nobody bugs you. And then after you graduate, you go back, finish up, and get a commission. And given that my draft lottery number at that point was such that I could wind up getting drafted. I could wind up waist deep in rice paddies at 100 degrees and 100% humidity with people trying to kill me actively versus being on a Navy ship, drinking a cup of coffee, having some air conditioning, some clean sheets, the decision kind of made itself. So I enrolled in that program, and on the 4th of April, 1972, a group of 4 of my college classmates and I all raised our right hands in a small Navy Reserve center in the town I did my undergraduate in, and enlisted in the United States Naval Reserves as officer candidates. And that summer, off we went to Newport, Rhode Island. And I will say that Newport, Rhode Island at that point was where they trained everybody but the aviation candidates. I was going to go for surface ships. My father and his father were Marine engineers. I knew ships, and I didn't think at that time that I was going to be able to get through something as rigorous as flight training. Went through, went back for my fourth and final year in undergraduate. And in about April of 1973, the U.S. active commitment in Vietnam pretty much came to an end, and so did the draft. The Navy reached out to each and every one of us, said, if you guys want to call it quits, we're fine. No harm, no foul. See you around. And along with my other 4 friends, we all said, you know what? We're halfway through OCS. Let's see if we can finish it. And so we graduated, and 4 of us, there was one guy who got a little bit delayed. 4 of us went back to officer candidate school, finished up, and on the 28th of September of 1973, we were all commissioned as ensigns in the U.S. Navy. And I might add, at that point, because of the big drawdown, instead of going to a ship, I had requested Europe and ships and all this other great stuff. The Navy, in its wisdom, decided that they wanted to assign me right back to Naval Air Station, North Island, in an office space 5 blocks from the home I grew up in. So join the Navy to see the world and go right back home. That was an incredibly fortunate set of experiences, because I was around some amazing naval aviators and the first naval flight officers I got to meet. And they all said, God, you're such an airplane nerd. You so get the history of naval aviation. You know about all of this stuff. Why don't you put in for naval flight officer training? And I figured, well, if all these senior guys are telling me I ought to do this, I ought to give it a shot. And took some batteries of exams, did apparently pretty well on them, put in my request. I might add, at that time, I also had the incredible honor and privilege to serve on the staff of Rear Admiral James B. Stockdale, the very well-known prisoner of war and Medal of Honor recipient. And even he said, hey, you should give this a try. You got to go for it. You won't know unless you try it. And lo and behold, in either what some people probably consider a grotesque mistake or a bit of absolute brilliant insight, the Navy said, sure, come on down to Pensacola. And in March of 1974, no, March of 75, off I drove to Pensacola, Florida, and started the Navy pre-flight program. And at that time, you did what was called pre-flight. It was academics, the first set of survival schools, water training, all sorts of different things over the space of a few weeks. The initial weeding out, as it were. A lot of extra physical exams, a lot of stuff like that. Somehow I got whipped into shape. I got a whole bunch of mathematics and things that I had not been exposed to before, because I took my undergraduate degree in history. In fact, the only science and technology exposure I had had in undergraduate was a year of astronomy. From there on to Training Squadron 10, VT-10 at Pensacola. and what would be the primary phase. It was academics, the first experience with an aircraft simulator, and then our first flights. 50 years ago, this past June, I got up in the morning, kissed my girlfriend goodbye, got in my car, and drove out to Naval Air Facility Softly Field. And everyone who is been through the naval aviation training around my era know about Softly Field, and climbed into the back of a Beech T-34B, and off I went for my first Navy training flight, which was basic cross-country navigation, which we had trained in the simulator and learned all of the how you're supposed to do it, and flew around. I can't remember now if we flew at 120 knots or 150. I think it was 120 knots, 2 miles a minute, 2 nautical miles a minute, and navigated around a basic course and did some maneuvers and things like that. And off I went into the training cycles. At that time, after primary and the intermediate phase, which is when we got introduced to jet flying, the backseat of the North American T-2C Buckeye, the Thunder Guppy, as it was known, and learning to think at 250 knots and faster. It takes a while for your brain, if you're not used to it, to catch up to that. So there's all sorts of stories about, well, how many miles were you behind the jet on your first flight? And the instructors all knew that. They then took where we wanted to go in our respective communities and looked at both our academic grades and our flight aptitude grades, how had we done in our flight phases, and winnowed us out. The guys with the giant brains, they all went to the E-2 because that is such a complex aircraft. From a NFO point of view, you need somebody with just immense intellectual capacity. There were guys who wanted to do what's now called maritime MPA. At that time, it was airborne ASW, strictly from land-based, the VP community, patrol community, P3s. They all went off to do extended jet navigation, generally with the Air Force at Mather Air Force Base in the version of the early model of the 737, the T-43. The rest of us either went to fighters or to what was called advanced jet navigation, because I wanted to be on jets off aircraft carriers. I might, as a footnote, when I was at NAS North Island and working for Admiral Stockdale, I worked on the public affairs, publicity, whatever you want to call it, aspect of the introduction of the Lockheed S-3 Viking aircraft. So I had worked on the whole fleet introduction of the Viking, and I either wanted to do Vikings or the EA-6B Prowler. During primary and intermediate, some of the ground school stuff involved getting briefed on all these aircraft types. And parenthetically, we got some briefs on, oh yeah, this is the A-3 Skywarrior. It's only now does a little bit of stuff in the reserves. Don't worry about that. And it does some reconnaissance, but they're all going away, so don't worry about it. You'll never get orders to Wales. You want the EA-6B if you're going to get into electronic warfare. Remember those words.
Yeah.
Went off to advanced jet navigation, and 50 weeks after I started my pre-flight training at Pensacola, I stood in the then atrium ahead of I forget which Apollo capsule it was, and received my wings as a naval flight officer, having been told that morning that I was going to EA-6Bs at Whidbey Island, and on the following Monday, I would start a 18-week course in electronic warfare there in Pensacola at another base. So that was an incredible moment. I might add at that point, and I think it still holds true, we lost about 50% of the student naval flight officers who started the original course. The course attrition was around 50%, and I believe it's still around that number. This is not an easy course. And that was one of those moments you go, wow, I kind of put my mind to something and I achieved it. Wow, that's cool. Following Monday, I started EW school. I made a phone call during a break to the person who handled ongoing orders to newly winged naval flight officers. He was down in Corpus Christi. And knowing that I was going to EA-3Bs, knowing they were at Whidbey Island, Washington, I innocently asked him, well, sir, when can I expect to get orders to the RAG at Whidbey, out there on the West Coast? And he very charmingly surprised, oh, son, you're mistaken. You are going to the West Coast of Spain. You're going to VQ2 in Rota, Spain.
Wow.
Wait, what? Huh? Nobody told me this. All I knew about them is we couldn't ask questions about it yet. And they flew a version of the P3 called the EP3E and that reconnaissance version of the A3 that's going away. And since I knew I wanted to fly jets off of aircraft carriers, then I was going to fly the Whale. My mind was set. I might add, at that point, I took my then fiance, my future wife, to the Naval Aviation Museum there at Pensacola, the famous museum, took her out behind the building and showed her the A3 that they had on display. They have an NA3A. I said, see that? That's the A-3 Skywarrior. That's the airplane I'm going to fly, dear. And she took it all in. And as we were driving back to our apartment, she said, so you took me to a museum to see the airplane you're going to fly? Which kind of set the... And of course, I was like, well, yeah. After going through the EW curriculum, and it is a tribute to the Navy's patience and perseverance and a charming thing known as program textbooks. I got force-fed what we were told was the Princeton University Double E undergraduate program major in about, I want to say it was 10 or 12 weeks long. 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. We were in class learning everything we needed to know about Double E. Almost every bit of it I have forgotten, but I knew it pretty well at that point. Continued the rest of the curriculum, learned about the RF spectrum and all the wonderful electrons that are flying out there around us at all the times. Went through Navy SEER school. Nothing like losing 16 pounds in 5 days, but we were outdoors. Ask anybody who on the East Coast went through the SEER school at Brunswick, also known as the Rangeley Hilton, and we'll leave it at that. My new wife and I went off to Rota, Spain, and there my education began.
Yes, so let's talk us through that. Well, first of all, before we get into your time there, can you basically give us like a bit of a background of the A3? Because I had a few roles, but what was its original role when it came into US Navy service?
She was designed to fit a very specific specification that NavAir put out in the late 1940s to all the major manufacturers. It was euphemistically, we need a carrier-based jet aircraft to carry a large object. I think they said device because we didn't use that word then. That could be accessed in flight by a crew member at high speeds, high altitudes for a range upwards of well over 1,000 nautical miles. They were looking for a 2,000 plus mile range, a combat radius in excess of 1,000 nautical miles. Everybody went, and it was designed for the then designed and being put together United States class of aircraft carriers. Everybody knew it was going to be a nuclear bomber. I had the honor of meeting and listening to Ed Heinemann, the designer, talk about the design of the A3 several times. Everybody was told 100,000 pounds, and that's what everybody was looking at. The story goes the night before the Douglas team was getting ready to make their assignment, make their presentation in Nav Air, Heinemann realized 100,000 pounds was going to be unworkable and literally sat down with his design team in their hotel room in DC and redesigned the aircraft. And were able to present an 83,000 pound max gross weight, swept wing, high altitude nuclear bomber to the Navy. Wow. This was about 1948, 49. Crazy. Which led to why some of the things in the A3 were the way they were, because of where we stood in technology at that time. But yeah, she started off as a nuclear bomber, and that requirement to have essentially they designed a large rectangular bomb bay with a companionway from the pressurized cockpit area back to the bomb bay led to the fact that the A3 outlived so many of the aircraft that were designed for its replacement, because it became insanely versatile to do an enormous amount of roles that had nothing to do with nuclear weapons delivery.
Let's talk about your time on the EA-3B. So yeah, talk us through some of your ground and flying training and a bit of the background of that aircraft when you started on that platform.
Sure. A3 did signals intelligence collection. I can say that. We had a mixed crew of folks, not only from our squadron working electronic warfare, essentially intercepting signals, plotting them, analyzing them real time, saying this is an emitter associated with this weapon system or that weapon system, or, oh yeah, that's that early warning system, and some other folks on board to also intercept a lot of other signals that were out there. And we all worked together. We were a small crew. We had a pilot and navigator up front. And then there was generally what we called the Senior Electronic Warfare Tactical Evaluator, the SEVAL, SEVAL, all the way in the back in the fourth seat to the rearmost seat. I was between a bulkhead and a fuel tank. I was the last guy.
Right.
And then we had two other electronic warfare operators, and I was also operating equipment. And then we had two positions that were for other parts of the RF spectrum. We worked mainly for the carrier group commander. We essentially, from a tactical point of view, extended his battle group horizon. You know, we would go out and say, okay, this is what's going on in our region today. Because of our high speed and our long legs, we could launch off a carrier. We normally did 2 cycle intervals. Carrier cycle at that point running between an hour and 30 minutes, an hour and 45 minutes. We would be gone until the end of the second cycle. That gave us an enormous range and allowed our collection horizon to go out. Part of the mission of VQ2, our land base and our carrier base, was also in response to national tasking. DC, we need to know what's going on in X, in Y, Z, You guys go out and you go take a look. Go sniff. I will say very much for the record, we always stayed in international airspace. That was part of the rule, the gentleman's agreement at that point between us and everyone else. You stayed in international airspace. You never gave them an excuse to do what had happened, and we were briefed on this going back to the late 1940s, and that was get shot down. And they shot down a lot of us. In using the collection capability of the A3 to passively target stuff at sea or on land, which meant we stayed in standby. They would up on someone. We also flew missions that were specifically tasked by the National Command Authority as part of the Peacetime Aerial Reconnaissance Program, PARPRO, which came out of the black in, I think, 2003. We were very heavily classified. We went through a lot of screening on our backgrounds and everything else before we were given the clearances. Because of VQ, the front end of the A3, the pilots and the navigators, all got to go through what's now called the Fleet Replacement Squadron, was then called the RAG, Replacement Air Group. They got introduced to the whale back in the States. The back end folks like me, we had an in-house EW program briefing us and training us on the equipment in the backs of both the EP3 and the EA3. And then we were thrown into it. Off we went, off the boat, first time. Now you're tweaking and geeking for real under the tutelage of a trained SEVAL. And that process took many months. And first you became what was called a first eval, which meant you could do non-nationally tasked missions off the boat. Doing what are the Russians doing in the Gulf of Hammam at Anchorage today? What's out there? What are the Egyptians up to this week? Stuff like that. And then you passed another check ride to become a SEVAL full-fledged. And at that point, you had the responsibility of running any mission tasked to the EA3 or my EP3 brethren, running the whole back end show by yourself.
A lot of responsibility.
Yeah. You don't really think of it. You look back on it and go, holy crap, they wanted me to do that at my age and my level of experience, but it somehow worked. And we also had guys coming back for their second tours, especially in the EP3, not so much in the EA3. We did have a lot of guys who were SEVALs in the EA3 go to the VAQ community into EA-6Bs. And I think the consensus was they brought a level of knowledge of the electronic order of battle in either the Pacific or the Mediterranean that was head and shoulders above their peers. So they brought an extra added thing to the VAQ community.
And I have to ask, what do you think the strengths and weaknesses of the aircraft were, and maybe the systems as well? You probably can't go into detail, but generally the strengths and weaknesses of the EA-3.
The whale was funny. For chronically in the whale community, because the decision had first been made, the wind down of the Vietnam War, that we don't need whales anymore, they're going to go away. Parts were hard to find. I mean, literally, our maintenance people had to search inventories all over the world looking for some parts. And it came in waves. You'd finally have a lot of airplanes flying, and then suddenly it was hard to get 2 or 3 up and ready to go because something weird or odd had broken. You couldn't find them in the inventory. Because there was also EA-3Bs flying in the Pacific with Fleet Air Reconnaissance Squadron 1, VQ-1, our sister squadron. So we're both scrambling for EW parts. And then there were, at that point, one other big squadron, VAQ-33, They were flying a version of the photo reconnaissance A3 called the ERA-3B, which was an aggressor jammer. So everybody's scrambling for common parts to the A3 as well as specific parts. At the time I was in the EA-3B, that was our biggest pain, was finding parts and having things break. That got ameliorated later, but at the time I was on it, it was a remarkably great aircraft as far as capabilities. Uh, there was a passive ESM system in the EA-6B at that time that was entirely, the answers to what you were looking at came out of a computer,
Okay.
but it was only as good as its database. We had a better database. And we were doing it real time by nuance rather than waiting for a computer to tell us. We would get raw, what would be called raw data, raw signal. We knew the little nuances between a signal that was, oh yeah, that is a early warning air detection radar on a Soviet Kashin class destroyer versus, no, that's the air traffic control radar at Malta.
All right, so you got
Yeah. And it's those little nuances that our gear was able, and we had a wide variety of gear, some of it the finest gear of the late 1960s, all the way up to stuff that was insanely advanced for the late 1970s, stuff you didn't see in other aircraft and other equipment until 5 or 10 years later. And we had a lot of stuff that was manufactured in-house. We had in-house civilian representatives. We didn't ask who they worked for. They didn't tell us, who would have these incredibly breadboarded pieces of equipment, say, hey, we just put in a new antenna that does this and this and this in these three birds. Go out, give it a try. Tell us what you think. You know?
Yeah.
And you know, the strength of it was we could come back, and we did have covered communications in the aircraft, so we could talk to some people. We could come back and tell the admiral's staff right away what's going on. This is where we felt we shined most in comparison with the rivet joint guys, who I did wind up flying with, by the way. I have some mission series in RC-135s in my Navy logbook. They collected and let somebody else do the analytics. VQ always prided itself on its real-time analytical capabilities. We could tell you what we saw right away and then send off anything data we had recorded for more fine-grained analysis elsewhere. But we were right there, right then. I think for us, and we also what we did every day of the week was exactly what we were going to do in wartime. We weren't dropping practice bombs. We weren't doing practice radar intercepts. We were doing the real thing, real time, every day. And I think that made our skills, and we were very valued. You know, we were eventually embraced by the ES-3, and I was at that time on staff at a site in Oceana, Virginia, Dam Neck, teaching battle group staffs how to do stuff. And when the Navy, when the bean counters took away the ES-3, the battle group commanders were absolutely shocked, appalled, and very, very upset that they had lost their integrated SIGINT platform.
Wow, really?
So we were the bastard stepchild of the air wings. Let me make no doubt about that. The A3 by the late 70s was a bridle-equipped launch aircraft, of which there were very few, if any, remaining. So we were a pain in the ass to the deck handlers. We were huge. Has anybody ever talked to you about what deck multiple means?
No, actually, no.
It's a standardized footprint on the flight deck of how much space your airplane takes up.
Right.
And I think at that time on the F-14 squadrons, the F-14 was 1.0. So the A-7 was loved because it was less than 1.0. The A-6B was loved because it was under 1.0. The Vigilante was not loved, not only because of the fact that they broke down more than we did, but also their deck multiple was huge, and so was the Whale. So we were always at that point an add-on. We didn't move our detachments onto a carrier until it came into the Mediterranean, ready for its 6-month deployment. Earlier on and later on, the A3s actually, based on the recommendations a lot of us made in the late 70s, went to the United States, back across the Atlantic, and integrated early into the air wing. And that paid great dividends. But depending on the aircraft carrier commander and the air wing commander, either we were welcomed with open arms or we were those guys. And we were a pain in the ass. And they're here because the admiral wants it. So varying cruises that I was on. And since I was at that point a geographic bachelor, I was living on the boat more than I was living in Rhoda. We were either loved or we were, like I say, the bastard stepchild that nobody wanted to admit existed.
So you were very polarizing.
Oh, absolutely.